So, we're kicking off a week-long celebration of Edgar Allan Poe that'll have tons of poems and stories of music and dancing and numerous of the virtual world's best storytellers. We're both in Second Life and Hypergrid at Kitely, of course. And we have to launch one more stream. Jeez. And we have 4 separate audio streams running 24/7, presenting lots of fun material in the Poe listening rooms and the interactive Ravens Chamber. We're even live on YouTube. Yeah, if you have an extra monitor, you want to pop over and look at YouTube, go for it. A lot of this will be sticking around even after the week's out. The schedule for the week, though, is pretty full, so I'd encourage you to visit the event portal where you can visit and get the live YouTube link and share it with your non-VW friends who wonder what the heck is it you get up to in SL anyway. And by the way, if you'd like to read along with the stories, quietly at home to yourself, or just download the stories, all the text is available for you right now. You can find it on the event portal. Okay. I'm going to say this several times over the next 7 days, I'm sure, but right now, thank you to everyone who helped make this happen. You know who you are. You in the front row. So, Edgar Allan Poe is arguably one of the world's, one of the most widely known American writers in history. In fact, ShareRanks.com places Edgar Allan Poe as the number 4 greatest American writer of all time, with only Mark Twain, William Faulkner, and Ernest Hemingway beating him out for the top 3 spots. And though I like those folks, I probably listened a lot more and read a lot more Edgar Allan Poe in my life than I have any of them, with Mark Twain as a close second. Poe did a lot of different things with his writing during a short 40-year life, but he is most remembered for his stories of mystery and the macabre. He left an impression on generations of readers who've explored the dark side of mankind through his works. Edgar Allan Poe's life was almost as troubled as some of his writings. Death and failure surrounded him, and he fought alcohol and drug abuse for most of his adult life. Could it be the best art comes from the most troubled souls? Edgar Allan Poe certainly supports that notion. Poe's work had a huge influence on popular culture. Books and films inspired by his works are easy to come by. He's also inspired, though, generations of musicians who have been attracted to his melancholy writings, and we'll be exploring some of those in our 2 dances this week. Now, on to Poe, kicking off, of course, with The Raven. That's a pause to get a quick thing of what then we'll go. Can you hear that? Looks like the microphone's picking that up. Pretty cool. That's on the other side of the room. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, "only this and nothing more." Distinctly I remember. It was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, that it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you." Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, nothing more. Deep into that darkness, peering long, I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortals ever dared to dream before, but the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore? This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more. Though I also heard someone say, Welcome, Eric. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and fluttered, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door with such a name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on that placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing further than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, Nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, Doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore of never, nevermore. But the raven, still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door, and then upon the velvet sinking I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking, Nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee respite, respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate, yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home be horror haunted. Tell me, truly I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aden it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Be that word our sign and parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked upstarting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. Great way to start a nice, pleasant morning. Okay, then. Thanks, guys. Welcome, Eric. Good to see you. And Fuzz. And folks, and looks like one more joined us in YouTube. That's cool. I don't know who they are. How fascinating. Anyway, welcome. For Eric, we are on voice and we're on stream. Apparently, you've already heard that, though, and YouTube, of course. I got something funky in my sound, so I can't listen to sound, or else it goes, which is awful. So if you have anything to say, type it. Okay, so next up, The Fall of the House of Usher. Son quer est un luz suspendu, si to contoche raison der baranger. In the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half pleasurable, because poetic, sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or the terrible. "Hello, Innsmouth." I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few sank ridges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees. With an utter depression of the soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveller upon opium, the bitter lapse in everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. Here there was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it? I paused to think. What was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the house of Usher? It was a mystery all insoluble, nor could I grapple with the shadowy fancies that crowded upon me as I pondered. I was forced to fall back upon the unsatisfactory conclusion that while, beyond doubt, there are combinations of very simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us, still the analysis of this power lies among the considerations beyond our depth. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different Oops, we're back. Sorry about that. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify or perhaps to annihilate its capacity for sorrowful impression. And acting upon this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, and gazed down, with a shudder even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeled and inverted images of the grey sedge, and the ghastly tree stems, and the vacant eye-like windows. Nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom, I now proposed to myself a sojourn of weeks. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in my boyhood, but many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had lately reached me in a distant part of the country, a letter from Roderick, in which its wildly importunate nature had admitted of no other than a personal reply. The messenger gave evidence of a nervous agitation. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me, as his best and indeed his only personal friend, with a view of attempting, by the cheerfulness of my society, some alleviation of his malady. It was the manner in which all this and much more was said. It It was the apparent heart that went in with his request, which allowed me no room for hesitation, and I accordingly obeyed forthwith at what I still considered a very singular summons. Now, although as boys we had been even intimate associates, yet really knew little of my friend. His reserve had been always excessive and habitual. I was aware, however, that his very ancient family had been noted, time out of mind, for a peculiar sensibility of temperament, displaying itself through long ages in many works of exiled art, manifested of late in repeated deeds of munificent yet unobtrusive charity, as well as in passionate devotion to the intricacies, perhaps even more to the orthodox and easily recognizable beauties of musical science. I had learned, too, the very remarkable fact that the stem of the Usher race, all time honored as it was, had put forth at no period any enduring branches. In other words, that the entire family lay in the direct line of descent, and had always, with very trifling and very temporary variations, so lain. It was this deficiency I considered, while running over in thought the perfect keeping of the character of the premises, which the accredited character of the people, and while speculating upon the possible influences with the one in the long lapse of centuries might have exercised upon the other, was this deficiency, perhaps, of collateral issue in the consequent undeviating transmission from sire to son of the patrimony with the name which had at length so identified the two as to merge the original title of the estate in the quaint and equivocal appellation of the House of Usher, an appellation which seemed to include in the minds of peasantry who used it both the family and the family mansion. I have said that the whole effect of my somewhat childish experiment, that of looking down within the tarn, had been to deepen the first singular impression. There can be no doubt that the consciousness of the rapid increase of my superstition, for should I not so term it, served mainly to accelerate the increase itself. Such I have long known is the paradoxical law of all sentiments having terror as a basis. It might have been for this reason only that when I again uplifted my eyes to the house itself from its image in the pool, there grew in my mind a strange fancy, a fancy so ridiculous indeed that I but mention it to show the vivid force of the sensations which oppressed me. Then I had so worked upon my imagination as really to believe that about the whole mansion and the domain there hung an atmosphere peculiar to themselves and their immediate vicinity, an atmosphere which had no affinity with the air of heaven, but which had reeked up from the decayed trees, the grey wall, the silent tarn, a pestilent, mystic vapor, dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden-hued. Shaking off from my spirit what must have been a dream, I scanned more narrowly the real aspect of the building. Its principal features seemed to be that of an excessive antiquity. The discoloration of ages had been great. Minute fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in a fine tangled webwork from the eaves. Yet all this was apart from any extraordinary dilapidation. No portion of the masonry had fallen, and there appeared to be a wild inconsistency between its still perfect adaptation of parts and the crumbling condition of the individual stones. In this there was much that reminded me of the specious totality of old woodwork which had rotted for long years in some neglected vault with no disturbance from the breath of the external air. Beyond this indication of extensive decay, however, the fabric gave little token of instability. Perhaps the eye of a scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceptible fissure which, extending from the roof of the building in front, made its way down the wall in a zigzagging fashion till it became lost in the sullen waters of that tarn. Noticing these things, I rode over the short causeway to the house. A servant in waiting took my horse, and I entered the Gothic archway of the hall. A valet of stealthy step thence conducted me in silence through many dark and intricate passages in my progress and to the studio of his master. Much that I encountered on the way contributed, I know not how, to heighten the vague sentiments of which I have already spoken, while the objects around me, while the carvings of the ceilings, the somber tapestries of the walls, the ebon blackness of the floors, and the phantasmagoric armorial trophies which rattled as I strode, were but matters to such as which I had been accustomed from infancy. While I hesitated not to acknowledge how familiar was all this, I still wondered to find how unfamiliar were the fancies which ordinary images were stirring up. On one of the staircases, I met the physician of the family. His countenance, I thought, wore a mingled expression of low cunning and perplexity. He accosted me with trepidation and passed on. The valet now threw open a door and ushered me into the presence of his master. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long, narrow, pointed, and at so vast a distance from the black oaken floor as to be altogether inaccessible from within. Feeble gleams of encrimsoned light made their way through the trellis panes and served to render sufficiently distinct the more prominent objects around the eye. However, struggled in vain to reach the remoter angles of this chamber or the recesses of the vaulted and fretted ceiling. Dark draperies hung upon the walls. The general furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but failed to give any vitality to this scene. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow. An air of stern, deep, and irredeemable gloom hung over and pervaded all. Upon my entrance, Usher arose from a sofa on which he had been lying at full length and greeted me with a vivacious warmth which had much in it. I at first thought of overdone cordiality, of the constrained effort by the ennuyé man of the world. A glance, however, at his countenance convinced me of his perfect sincerity. We sat down, and for some moments, while he spoke not. I gazed upon him with a feeling half of pity, half of awe. Surely a man had never before been so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the man being before me with the companion of my early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been at all times remarkable. A cadaverousness of complexion, and an eye large, liquid, luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and very pallid, but of a surpassingly beautiful curve, a nose of a delicate Hebrew model, but with the breadth of nostril unusual in similar formations, a fine molded chin speaking in its want of prominence of a want of moral energy, hair of a more than web-like softness and tenuity. These features, with an inordinate expansion above the regions of the temple, made up altogether a countenance not easily to be forgotten. And now in the mere exaggeration of the prevailing character of these features and of the expression they were wont to convey lay so much of change that I doubted to whom I spoke. The now ghastly pallor of the skin, and the now miraculous luster of the eve, above all things startled and even awed me. The silken hair, too, had been suffered to grow all unheeded, and as in its wild gossamer texture it floated rather than fell about his face. I could not even with effort connect its arabesque expression with any idea of simple humanity. In the manner of my friend, I was at once struck with an incoherence and an inconsistency, and I soon found this to arise from a series of feeble and futile struggles to overcome a habitual trepidation, an excessive nervous agitation. For something of this nature I had indeed been prepared no less by his letter than by reminiscences of certain boyish traits and by conclusions deduced from his peculiar physical conformation and temperament. His action was alternately vivacious and sullen. His voice varied rapidly from a tremulous indecision when the animal spirit seemed utterly in abeyance to that species of energetic concision, that abrupt, weighty, unhurried, hollow-sounding enunciation, that leaden, self-balanced, and perfectly modulated guttural utterance which may be observed in the lost drunkard or the irreclaimable eater of opium during the periods of his most intense excitement. It was thus that he spoke of the object of my visit, of his earnest desire to see me, and of the solace he expected me to afford him. He entered at some length into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, a constitutional and family evil, and one for which he despaired to find a remedy. A mere nervous affection, he immediately added, which would soon undoubtedly pass off, and displayed itself in a host of unnatural sensations. Some of these, as he detailed them, bewildered me, although perhaps the terms and the general manner of the narration had their weight. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was alone unendurable. He could wear only garments of certain textures. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light. There were but peculiar sounds, these from stringed instruments which did not inspire him with horror. To an anomalous species of terror I found him a bounden slave. "Oh, I shall perish," said he. "I must perish in this deplorable folly. Thus, and not otherwise, shall I be lost. I dread the events of the future, not in themselves, but in their results. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident, which may operate upon this intolerable agitation of soul. I have indeed no abhorrence of danger, except in its absolute effect in terror. In this unnerved, in this pitiable condition, I feel that the period will sooner or later when I must abandon life and reason together in some struggle with the grim phantasm. Fear!" I learned moreover at intervals, and through broken and equivocal hints, another singular feature of his mental condition. He was enchained by certain superstitious impressions in regard to the dwelling in which he tenanted, and whence for many years he had never ventured forth, in regard to an influence whose suspicious force was conveyed in terms too shadowy here to be restated, an influence which some peculiarities of the mere form and substance of his family mansion had, by dint of long sufferance, said he, obtained over his spirit an effect which the physique of the grey walls and turrets and the dim tarn on which they all looked down had at length brought about upon the morale of his existence. Roderick admitted, however, that although his hesitation, that much of the peculiar gloom which thus afflicted him could be traced to a more natural and far more palpable origin, to the severe and long-continued illness, indeed to the evidently approaching dissolution of a tenderly beloved sister. His sister, his sole companion for long years, his last and only relative on this earth. "Oh, her decease," he said with a bitterness which I never forget, "would leave him the hopeless and the frail, the last of the ancient race of ushers." While he spoke, the Lady Madeline, for so was she called, passed slowly through a remote portion of the apartment, and without having noticed my presence disappeared. I regarded her with an utter astonishment, not unmingled with dread, and yet I found it impossible to account for such feelings. A sensation of stupor oppressed me as my eyes followed Madeline's retreating steps. When a door at length closed upon her, my glance sought instinctively and eagerly the countenance of the brother, but he had buried his face in his hands, and I could only perceive that a far more than ordinary wanness had overspread the emaciated fingers through which trickled many passionate tears. The disease of the Lady Madeline had long baffled the skill of her physicians. A settled apathy, gradually wasting away of the person, and frequent, although transient, affections of a partially cataleptic character were the unusual diagnosis. Hitherto she had steadily borne up against the pressure of her malady, and had not betaken herself finally to bed, but on the closing in of the evening of my arrival at the house she had succumbed, as her brother told me at night with inexpressible agitation, to the prostrating power of the destroyer, and I learned that the glimpse I had obtained of her person would thus probably be the last I should obtain, that the Lady Madeline, at least while living, would be seen by me no more. "Hey, Jilly." "Hey, Astro." Astromel, great name. "Welcome, welcome." For several days ensuing, Madeline's name was unmentioned by either Usher or myself, and during this period I was busied in earnest endeavors to alleviate the melancholy of my friend. We painted and read together, or I listened as if in a dream to the wild improvisations of his speaking guitar, and thus as a closer and still intimacy admitted me more unreservedly to the recesses of Roderick's spirit, the more bitterly did I perceive the utility of all attempt at cheering a mind from which darkness, as if inherent positive quality, poured forth upon all the objects of the moral and physical universe in one unceasing radiation of gloom. I shall never bear about me a memory of the many solemn hours I thus spent alone with the master of the house of Usher. Yet I should fail in any attempt to convey an idea of the exact character of the studies, or of the occupations in which he involved me, or led me the way. An excited and highly distempered ideality threw a sulphurous luster over all. His long, improvised dirges will ring forever in my ears. Among the other things, I hold painfully in my mind a certain singular perversion and amplification of the wild air of the last waltz of von Weber, from the paintings over which his elaborate fancy brooded, and which grew, touch by touch, into vagueness at which I shuddered the more thrillingly because I shuddered knowing not why. From these paintings, vivid as their images now are before me, I would in vain endeavor to deduce more than a small portion which should lie within the compass of merely written words. By the utter simplicity, by the nakedness of his designs, he arrested and overawed attention. If ever mortal painted an idea, that mortal was Roderick Usher. For me, at least, in the circumstances then surrounding me, there rose out of the pure abstractions which the hypochondriac contrived to throw upon his canvas an intensity of intolerable awe, no shadow of which felt I ever yet in the contemplation of the certainly glowing yet too concrete reveries of Fuseli. One of the phantasmagoric conceptions of my friend, partaking not so rigidly of the spirit of abstraction, may be shadowed forth, although feebly in words. A small picture presented the interior of an immensely long and rectangular vault or tunnel with low walls, smooth, white, without interruption or device. Certain accessory points of the design served well to convey the idea that this excavation lay at an exceeding depth below the surface of the earth. No outlet was observed in any portion of its vast extent. No torch or other artificial source of light was discernible. Yet in this picture a flood of intense rays rolled throughout and bathed the whole in a ghastly and inappropriate splendor. Now, I have just spoken of that morbid condition of the auditory nerve which rendered all music intolerable to the sufferer, with the exception of certain effects of stringed instruments. It was perhaps the narrow limits to which he thus confined himself upon the guitar, which gave birth, in great measure, to the fantastic character of his performances, but the fervid facility of his impromptus could not be so accounted for. They must have been, and were, in the notes as well as in the words of his wild fantasies, for he was not unfrequently accompanied with himself in rhymed verbal improvisations, the results of that intense mental collectedness and concentration to which I have previously alluded as observable only in particular moments of the highest artificial excitement. The words of one of these rhapsodies I have easily remembered. I was perhaps the more forcibly impressed with it as he gave it, because in the under or mystic current of its meaning I fancied that I perceived, and for the first time, a full consciousness on the part of Roderick Usher, of the tottering of Roderick's lofty reason upon our throne. The verses, which were entitled "The Haunted Palace," ran very neatly, if not accurately, thus: In the greenest of our valleys, by good angels tenanted, once fair and stately, palace, radiant palace, reared its head. In the monarch's thoughts dominion it stood there. Never seraph spread a pinion, however fabric half so fair. Banners yellow, glorious, golden, on its roof did float and flow. All this was in the olden time long ago. And every gentle air that dallied in that sweet day, along the ramparts plumed and pallid, a winged odor went away. Wanderers in that happy valley through two luminous windows saw spirits move musically to a lute's well-tuned law. Round about a throne where sitting Porphyrogeny, in his state his glory well befitting, the ruler of the realm was seen. And all with pearl and ruby glowing was the fair palace door, through which came flowing, 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 and sparkling evermore, a troop of echoes whose sweet duty was but to swing in voices of unsurpassing beauty, the wit and wisdom of their king. But evil things in robes of sorrow assailed the monarch's high castle. Ah, let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his home the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed. And the travelers now within that valley, through the red-litten windows, see vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody, while, like rapid ghastly river through the pale door, a hideous throng rush out forever, and laugh, but smile no more. I well remember that suggestions arising from this ballad led us into a train of thought wherein there became manifest an opinion of Usher's, which I mention not so much on account of its novelty, for other men have thought thus, as on account of its pertinacity with which he maintained it. This opinion, in its general form, was that of the sentience of all vegetable things. But in his disordered fantasy, the idea had assumed a more daring character, and trespassed under certain conditions upon the kingdom of inorganization. I lack words to express the full extent of the earnest abandon of his persuasion. The belief, however, was connected, as I have previously hinted, with the grey stones of the home of his forefathers. The conditions of the sentience had been there, he imagined, fulfilled in the method of collocation of these stones, in the order of their arrangement, as well as in that of the many fungi which overspread them, of the decayed trees which stood around them, above all, in the long undisturbed endurance of this arrangement and its reduplication, the still waters of the tarn without. Its evidence, the evidence of sentience all about, was to be seen, he said, and here I started as he spoke, in the gradual yet uncertain condensation of an atmosphere of their own about the waters and the walls. The result was discoverable, he added, in that silent yet importunate and terrible influence which for centuries had molded the destinies of his family, and which had made him what I now saw him, what he was. Such opinions need no comment, and I will make none. Our books, the books which for years had formed no small portions of the mental existence of the invalid. It did? Well, how frustrating is that? Oh, that's easy to fix, though, isn't it? We'll just go back over here. Shanton's still there telling stories, but that was the video feed. So we'll just switch the feedback over to here. Our books, the books which for years had formed no small portions of the mental existence of the invalid, were, as might be supposed, in strict keeping with this character of the phantasm. We pored together over such works as the Vervet, La Chartreuse au Gresset, the Belphegor of Machiavelli, the Heaven and Hell of Swedenborg, the Subterranean Voyage of Nicholas Klim by Holberg, the Chiromancy of Robert Fludd, Jean d'Agnay and de la Chambre, the Journey into the Blue Distance of Tieck, and the City of the Son of Campanella. One favorite volume was a small octavo of the Directorium Inquisitorium by the Dominican Aymeric de Giron, and there are passages in Pomponius Mele about the old African satyrs and Egyptians over which Roderick Usher would sit dreaming for hours. Yes, Roderick's chief delight, however, was found in the perusal of an exceedingly rare and curious book in quarto Gothic, the Manual of a Forgotten Church, the Vigile Motorum Secundum Coram Ecclesia Mogontae. That's a mouthful to have, isn't it? I could not help thinking of the wild ritual of this work, of its probable influence upon the hypochondriac, when one evening, having informed me abruptly that the Lady Madeline was no more, he stated his intention of preserving her corpse for a fortnight, previously to its final interment, in one of the numerous vaults within the main walls of the building. The worldly reason, however, assigned for this singular proceeding was one which I did not feel at liberty to dispute. The brother had been led to his resolution, so he told me, by consideration of the unusual character of the malady of the diseased, of certain obtrusive and eager inquiries on the part of Madeline's medical men, and of the remote and exposed situation of the burial ground of the family. I will not deny that when I called to mind the sinister countenance of the person whom I met upon the staircase. On the day of my arrival at the house, I had no desire to oppose what I regarded as was at best but a harmless and by no means unnatural precaution. At the request of Roderick Usher, I personally aided him in the arrangements for the temporary entombment of Madeline. The body having been encoffined, we two alone bore it to rest. The vault in which it was placed, and which had been so long unopened that our torches, half smothered in its oppressive atmosphere, gave us little opportunity for investigation. The vault was small, damp, entirely without means of admission for light. Lying at great depth immediately beneath that portion of the building in which was my own sleeping apartment, it had been used apparently in remote feudal times for the worst purposes of a donjon keep, and in later days as a palace of deposit for powder, or some other highly combustible substance, as a portion of its floor and the whole interior of the long archway through which we reached it was carefully sheathed with copper. The door, of massive iron, had been also similarly protected. Its immense weight caused an unusually sharp grating sound as it moved upon its hinges. Having deposited our mournful burden upon trestles within this region of horror, we partially turned aside and yet unscrewed lid of the coffin and looked upon the face of the tenant. A striking similitude between brother and sister now first arrested my attention, and Roderick, divining perhaps my thoughts, murmured out some few words which I learned that the deceased and himself had been twins, and that sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Our glances, however, rested not long upon the dead Madeline, for we could not regard her unawed. The disease which had thus entombed the lady in the maturity of youth had left, as usual in all maladies of strictly cataleptic character, the mockery of a faint blush upon the bosom and the face, and that suspiciously lingering smile upon the lip which is so terrible in death. We replaced and screwed down the lid of the coffin, and having secured the door of iron, we made our way, with toll, into the scarcely less gloomy apartments of the upper portion of the house. And now, some days of bitter grief having elapsed, an observable change came over the features of the mental disorder of my friend. His ordinary manner had vanished. His ordinary occupations were neglected or forgotten. He roamed from chamber to chamber with hurried, unequal, and objectless step. The pallor of his countenance had assumed, if possible, a more ghastly hue, but the luminousness of his eyes had utterly gone out. The once occasional huskiness of his tone was heard no more. And a tremulous quaver, as if in extreme terror, habitually characterized his utterance. There were times, indeed, when I thought Roderick's unceasingly agitated mind was laboring with some oppressive secret, to divulge which he struggled for the necessary courage. At times, again, I was obliged to resolve all into the mere inexplicable vagaries of madness, for I beheld him gazing upon vacancy for long hours in an attitude of the profoundest attention, as if listening to some imaginary sound. It was no wonder that his condition terrified, that it infected me. I felt creeping upon me, by slow yet certain degrees, the wild influences of his own fantastic yet impressive superstitions. It was especially upon retiring to bed late in the night of the 7th or 8th day after the placing of the Lady Madeline within the donjon that I experienced the full power of such feelings. Sleep came not near my couch, while the hours waned and waned away. I struggled to reason off the nervousness which had dominion over me. I endeavored to believe that much, if not all, of what I felt was due to the bewildering influence of the gloomy furniture of the room, of the dark and tattered draperies which, tortured into motion by the breath of a rising tempest, swayed fitfully to and fro upon the walls and rustled uneasily about the decorations of the bed. But my efforts were fruitless. An irrepressible tremor gradually pervaded my frame, and at length there sat upon my very heart an incubus of utterly causeless alarm. Shaking this off with a grasp and a struggle, I uplifted myself upon the pillows, and peering in earnestly within the intense darkness of the chamber, I hearkened. I know not why, except that an instinctive spirit prompted me. I hearkened to certain low and indefinite sounds which came through the pauses of the storm at long intervals, I knew not whence. Overpowered by an intense Sentiment of horror, unaccountable yet unendurable, I threw on my clothes with haste, for I felt that I should sleep no more during that night, and I endeavored to arouse myself from the pitiable condition into which I had fallen by pacing rapidly to and fro through the apartment. Welcome, Connor. I had taken but a few turns in this manner, when a light step on an adjoining staircase aroused my attention. I presently recognized it as that of Usher. In an instant afterward, he rapped with a gentle touch at my door and entered, bearing a lamp. His countenance was, as usual, cadaverously wan, but moreover there was a species of mad hilarity in Roderick's eyes, and evidently restrained hysteria in his whole demeanor. His hair appalled me, but anything was preferable to the solitude which I had so long endured, and I even welcomed his presence as a relief. Have you not seen it? He said abruptly, after having stared about him for some moments in silence. You have not seen it, then? Oh, but stay, you shall. Thus speaking, and having carefully shaded his lamp, he hurried to one of the casements and threw it freely open to the storm. The impetuous fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. It was indeed a tempestuous yet sternly beautiful night, and one wildly singular in its terror and its beauty. A whirlwind had apparently collected its force in our vicinity, for there were frequent and violent alterations in the direction of the wind, and the exceeding density of the clouds, which hung so low as to press upon the turrets of the house, did not prevent our perceiving the lifelike velocity with which they flew careering from all points against each other, without passing away into the distance. I say that even their exceeding density did not prevent our perceiving this. Yet we had no glimpse of the moon or the stars, nor was there any flashing forth of lightning. But under the surfaces of the huge masses of agitated vapor, as well as all terrestrial objects immediately around us, we were glowing in the unnatural light of a faintly luminous and distinctly visible gaseous exhalation which hung about and shrouded the entire mansion. You shall not behold this, said I, shudderingly to Usher, as I led him with a gentle violence from the window to a seat. These appearances which bewilder you are merely electrical phenomena, not uncommon, or it may be that they have their ghastly origin in the rank miasma of the tarn below. Let us close this casement. The air is chilling and dangerous to your frame. Here's one of your favorite romances, Roderick. I will read, you shall listen, and so we will pass away this terrible night together. The antique volume which I had taken up was The Mad Tryst of Sir Lancelot Canning, but I had called it a favorite of Usher's more in sad jest than earnestness. For in truth there is little in its uncouth and unimaginative prolixity which could have had an interest for the lofty and spiritual ideality of my friend. It was, however, the only book immediately at hand, and I indulged a vague hope that the excitement which now agitated this hypochondriac might find relief, for the history of mental disorder is full of similar anomalies, even in the extremeness of the folly which I should read. Could I have judged, indeed, by the wild, overstrained air of vivacity with which he hearkened, or apparently hearkened, to the words of the tale, I might well have congratulated myself upon the success of my design. I had arrived at that well-known portion of the story where Ethelred, the hero of the tryst, having sought in vain for a peaceable admission to the dwelling of the hermit, proceeds to make a good an entrance by force. Here will be remembered the words of the narrative run thus. And Ethelred, who was by nature of a doughty heart, and who was now mighty withal, on account of the powerfulness of the wine which he had drunken, waited no longer to hold parley with the hermit, who in sooth was of an obstinate and maliceful turn, but feeling the rain upon his shoulders, and fearing the rising of the tempest, uplifted his mace outright, and with blows made quickly the room in the plankings of the door for his gauntleted hand. And now pulling there was sturdily, he so cracked and ripped and tore all asunder that the noise of the dry and hollow-sounding wood alarmed and reverberated through the forest. At the termination of this sentence I started and for a moment paused, for it appeared to me, although I had once concluded that my excited fancy had deceived me, it appeared to me, I say, that from some very remote portion of the mansion there came distinctly to my ears what might have been, in its exact similarity of character, the echo, but a stifled and dull one certainly, of the very cracking and ripping sound which Sir Lancelot had so particularly described. It was beyond doubt the coincidence alone which had arrested my attention, for amid the rattling of the sashes of the casements and the ordinary commingled noises of the still increasing storm outside, the sound in itself had nothing, surely, which should have interested or disturbed me. So I continued the story. But the good champion Ethelred, now entering within the door, was more enraged and amazed to perceive no signal of the merciful hermit, but in the stead thereof a dragon of scaly and prodigious demeanour and a fiery tongue, which sate in guard before the palace of gold with a floor of silver. Upon the wall there hung a shield of shining brass, with this legend enwritten: Who entereth herein a conqueror hath been, who slayeth the dragon, that shield he shall win. And Ethelred uplifted his mace, and struck upon the head of the dragon, which fell before him, and gave up his pesty breath with a shriek so horrid and harsh, and withal so piercing, that Ethelred had fain to close his ears with his hands against the dreadful noise of it, like the whereof was never heard before. Poor dragon! Here again I paused abruptly, now with a feeling of wild amazement, for there could be no doubt whatever that in this instant I did actually hear, although from what direction it proceeded I found it impossible to say, a low and apparently distant but harsh, protracted, and most unusual screaming or grating sound, the exact counterpart of what my fancy had already conjured up for the dragon's unnatural shriek as described by the romancer. Oppressed as I certainly was upon the occurrence of this second and most extraordinary coincidence by 1,000 conflicting sensations, in which wonder and extreme terror were predominant, I still retained sufficient presence of mind to avoid exciting by any observation the sensitive nervousness of my companion. I was by no means certain that he had noticed the sounds in question, although assuredly a strange alteration had, during the last few minutes, taken place in Roderick's demeanour. From a position fronting my own, he had gradually brought round his chair, so as to sit with his face to the door of the chamber, and thus I could but partially perceive his features, although I saw that his lips trembled as if he were murmuring inaudibly. His head had dropped upon his breast, and yet I knew that he was not asleep. And from the wide and rigid opening of the eyes, I caught a glance of it in profile. The motion of his body, too, was at variance with this idea, for he rocked from side to side with a gentle yet constant and uniform sway. Having rapidly taken notice of all this, I resumed the narrative of Sir Launcelot, which thus proceeded. And now the champion, having escaped from the terrible fury of the dragon, bethinking himself of the brazen shield, of the breaking up the enchantment which was upon it, removed the carcass from out of the way before him, and approached valorously over the silver pavement of the castle to where the shield was upon the wall, which in sooth tarried not for his full coming, but fell down at his feet upon the silver floor, with a mighty, great, and terrible ringing sound. No sooner had these syllables passed my lips than, as if a shield of brass had indeed at that moment fallen heavily upon the floor of silver, became aware of a distinct, hollow, metallic, and clangorous, yet apparently muffled reverberation. Completely unnerved, I leaped to my feet, but the measured rocking movement of Roderick Usher was undisturbed. I rushed to the chair in which he sat. His eyes were bent fixedly before him. Throughout his whole countenance there reigned a stony rigidity. But as I placed my hand upon his shoulder, there came a strong shudder over his whole person. A sickly smile quivered about his lips, and I saw that he spoke in low, hurried, and gibbering murmur, as if unconscious of my presence. Bending closely over him, I at length drank in the hideous import of his words. Not hear it? Yes, I hear it. I have heard it. Long, many minutes, many hours, many days have I heard it. Yet I dared not. Oh, pity, miserable wretch that I am. I dared not speak. Oh, we have put her living in the tomb. Said I not that my senses were acute? I now tell you that I heard her first feeble movements in the hollow coffin. I heard them many, many days ago, yet I dared not speak, and oh, how tonight, Ethelred, the breaking of the hermit's door, the death cry of the dragon, the clangor of the shield, say rather the rending of her coffin, the grating of the iron hinges of her prison, and her struggles within the coppered archway of the vault. Oh, whither shall I fly? Oh, will she not be here anon? Is she not hurrying to upbraid me for my haste? Have I not heard her footstep on the stair? Do I not distinguish that heavy and horrible beating of her hideous heart? Madman! Here he sprang furiously to his feet and shrieked out his syllables as if in the effort he were giving up his soul. Madman! I tell you that she now stands without the door! As if in the superhuman energy of his utterance there had been found the potency of a spell. The huge antique panels to which the speaker pointed threw slowly back upon the instant ponderous and ebony jaws. It was the work of the rushing gust, but then without those doors there did stand the lofty and enshrouded figure of the Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood upon her white robes, the evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold, and with a low moaning cry fell heavily inward upon the person of her brother, and her violent and now final death agonies bore him to the floor a corpse and a victim to the terrors he had anticipated. From that chamber, from that mansion, I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath as I found myself crossing the old causeway. Suddenly there shot along the path a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued. For the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting and blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through the once barely discernible fissure which I have before spoken as extending from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction to the base. And while I gazed, the fissure rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of the whirlwind. The entire orb of the satellite burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous shouting like the sound of a voice of 1,000 waters. And the deep and dank tarn at my feet closed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the house of Usher. Dun-dun-dun-dun. Well said, Connor. Okay, then. Well, right at the top of the hour, but let's regale you with one quick poem, huh? A dream within a dream. Take this kiss upon the brow, and in parting from you now, thus much let me avow. You are not wrong who deem that my dreams, my days have been a dream. Yet if hope has flown away, and a night or in a day, in a vision or in none, is it therefore the less gone? All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream. I stand amid the roar of a surf-tormented shore, and I hold within my hand grains of the golden sand, how few, yet how they creep through my fingers to the deep, while I weep, while I weep. O God, can I not grasp them with a tighter clasp? O God, can I not save one from the pitiless wave? Is all that we see or seem but a dream within a dream? So, thank you for joining us for the first day of a week-long Edgar Allan Poe birthday celebration. Happy 212th birthday, Edgar. We will be back tomorrow for 2 sessions at 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. And then 10 a.m. on Wednesday and Thursday, and 7 p.m. on Thursday for stories, 5 p.m. on Thursday for a dance, and 8 p.m. on Friday for more stories, and then Saturday at 11 o'clock for a dance and 1 o'clock for stories. Did you catch all that? Probably not. But you can visit the event portal right here, and see what's going on and when and where. So thank you. Thank you again for everybody helping me put this together and help promote it for us. And for those of you out there in Streamland on the big YouTube, thanks for tuning in. And I hope that you have a wonderful afternoon and a happy 2021. And hey, see you tomorrow morning, right? Yay.